Welcome to the Four Witnesses of the Messiah, Chapter 6, Session 12A, Into the Darkness. For the past few sessions, we've witnessed some of the greatest moments in Jesus' teaching ministry. Jesus had brought his apostles to the edge of the stratosphere spiritually, but now the emotional roller coaster would plunge them unprepared down the precipice into the darkness, and the purple smoke would turn black. Soon after he delivered this sermon, he was arrested, and in the chaotic moments of that confrontation, all could have been lost. His apostles could have been arrested with him, or worse. But incredibly, Jesus managed that situation to achieve the goal that his apostles be spared. Despite his own situation, he indeed loved them unto the end. All four Gospels tell of this incident, and we are going to see the extent that his Father had prepared him. It was like Jesus had a script that he memorized, and then he played his part to steer all the uncooperative participants through the minefield that was ahead. With all the contributing details from the rest of the Gospels, these events can be vividly portrayed. So the next event after Gethsemane is Event 6.32. Event 6.32, Judas and the mob arrive. Please turn to Luke 22. Luke 22:47. And while Jesus yet spake, behold, a multitude, and he that was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them, and drew near unto Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? Parallel passage is Mark 14:43. Mark 14:43. And immediately while he yet spake, came Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Take him, and lead him away safely. And as soon as he was come, he went straightway to him, and said, Master, Master, and kissed him. Then the other passage is in Matthew 26. Matthew 26:47. And while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now he that betrayed him gave them a sign, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he, hold him fast. And forthwith it came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, wherefore art thou come? And then finally, John 18:3. Judas said, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh hither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Now look at verse 4, John 18:4. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things. We're going to see how prepared God had prepared his Son with the information. He knew the script, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? Now, John 18:4 affirms that Jesus had received guidance from his Father about this impending situation, and he was thoroughly prepared. We shall see how the events played out, and the potential chaos was avoided to produce the improbable result that Jesus was remanded to their custody but all the apostles were allowed to go free. It could have been much, much worse. Some may think that the arrest of Jesus was an ugly deed, and it was, but there's more to it. First of all, it had to occur in order for Jesus to die for us. So, it indeed was a pivotal event between light and darkness. Before this, Jesus had avoided potentially dangerous situations because it wasn't the time yet for him to die or suffer. But now it was time, and he had to surrender himself to the dark realm, giving himself over to them to let them do their terrible but necessary dirty deeds. But even this had to be done right. Because if things went wrong in those chaotic moments, all could be lost. So his Father prepared him. And also earlier that day, Jesus had made an unusual request of his followers. Look at Luke 22:35. Luke 22:35. And he said unto them, When I sent you without purse and scrip and shoes, did you lack anything? That's when they went out 2 by 2 earlier in Galilee. And they said, Nothing. And then he said unto them, But now he that hath a purse, let him take it. And likewise his scrip, his luggage, take it. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say unto you, that this that is written must yet be accomplished in me. And he was reckoned among the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. And they said, Lord, behold, here are 2 swords. And he said unto them, It is enough. Now, in last session, we determined that there was a time period between verse 37 and 38 that we determined before. Even though that was an unusual request that Jesus made for his followers to have swords, that really is a strange request. Obviously, the situation had changed from months earlier when they went out 2 by 2. And therefore, the earlier guidance might not apply. So, things changed. Many are apt to quote Jesus saying, Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. But they don't acknowledge that Jesus himself recommended the swords be obtained in the first place. Why? Well, Jesus was preparing his people to both be ready to fight and to have their possessions, their purse and their bag, intact so they could flee. He'd received revelation, instructions to produce the right balance of deterrence, which were the swords, and then the words and the actions that were necessary so that after the dust cleared, his apostles and even their possessions would be safe. That certainly was a tall order to achieve, that none of the apostles be harmed in the uncontrollable, uncertain moments ahead. It would certainly be a goal of his adversaries to totally crush his movement by not only arresting and killing Jesus, but taking out his entourage as well. But Jesus was not going to let the adversary be in charge of his surrender and let the situation get out of control. Not one bit. Well, how much did Jesus know? Well, John 13:1 said he knew that all things were in his hands. And then John 13:3 declared that he knew his hour was come. We're going to see illustrated in this incident how well informed Jesus was. His Father indeed had given him comprehensive preparation by revelation. So Jesus boldly took the initiative. So when the raid began, Jesus bravely spoke to the mob, Whom seek ye? He was not going to cower behind his supporters like a criminal might. He courageously stepped forward. John 18:4. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said to them, Whom seek ye? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. And as soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, Who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I've told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake of them, which thou gavest me, I have lost none. Oh, wow! What presence Jesus had. Because, that was quite unusual, that when he identified himself, the mob reacted the way they did. They fell backward. Well, why was that? I don't think it was because he said some magic words. In fact, he didn't even say, I am, like the theologians went, because, it wasn't some mystical, powerful, magic words. Why? Because there's no such word as am in Aramaic or biblical Hebrew. Now, I'm not talking about modern Hebrew. That's different. But I'm talking about biblical Hebrew. So he couldn't even said what they want. So there's absolutely no connection here between what he said in Exodus 3:14. That also happens to be a mistranslation. I thoroughly covered that in both our One God of Original Christianity class and our Old Testament history class. So there's got to be another reason for that reaction. Were there some in that raiding party who expected this to be a cakewalk and then had to rethink and fall back to a different strategic position when Jesus stood forth so boldly? One could postulate all kinds of scenarios to explain what really happened then. But let's take a look at the facts to try to let them explain. So, first, who was in this mob? It was made up of a hastily assembled group of temple guards and priest servants. Judas had told the high priest where they could find Jesus away from the crowds, so they had to act quickly with whoever was available. These were not soldiers, experienced fighters and killers, even though they were willing to fight to the death to protect the temple and the priests. It was night. It was the second shift. Maybe these were not the primary staff who guarded the temple during the daytime services, although most of the other temple jobs were determined by lot to avoid favoritism. But they were not a bunch of thugs. They were primarily a select group of Levites, trusted believers, loyal to the high priest in the temple. But they certainly knew who they were sent out to arrest. And some of them in that detachment may have even been in the crew that had been sent to arrest Jesus 6 months earlier at the Feast of Tabernacles. Remember? They came back empty-handed. But even if they weren't involved back then, they certainly heard about that incident. The high priest had demanded why that earlier detachment was not successful in arresting Jesus. And their response was, quote, "No man has ever spoken like this man." Wow. So those temple guards were Levites. They were men of integrity who had witnessed the greatest teachers of their time, because they were on guard during the daily temple services. They had heard the Word of God taught by the best in first century Judaism. Do you think that some of them may have had mixed feelings about this hastily organized late evening assignment? I think the fact that they fell backward reveals a lot about their state of mind. Furthermore, This Jesus was the same one who had just made 2 triumphal entries into Jerusalem, in which many in the crowds declared that he indeed was the Messiah. I think that there had to be some in that group who were wondering if that was really true. And would he rain fire down upon them like what happened with Elijah and the sets of 50 that had come to arrest him? Was this what Judas was hoping would happen if Jesus got cornered? Would he come out fighting like the military Messiah that many thought he should be? So, how would you feel if you were roped into that hastily organized nighttime assignment? Would you be a bit tentative? And so you come upon him to arrest him, and when you ask which one is the one you're seeking, Jesus boldly steps forth and declares he's the one you seek. Well, what's going to happen next? You just lost your momentum. Wouldn't you be nervous? I think that in part explains their reaction. Jesus was so bold, they were really taken aback. But for those who have eyes to see, there's a spiritual explanation for what just transpired. Those of us who walk with power and are aware of the spiritual battle going all around us often see whispers and shadows of its effects. Sometimes even as we simply are walking down a street, we see people inexplicably turn around and run away. While I was writing my book, the volume 4, a fellow minister recounted an incident to me when he was just walking towards 2 individuals approaching from the opposite direction, and God whispered in his ear, "Watch this." And as they passed, one of the individuals fell to the ground. Why did this incident come to his mind right then to tell me? Because I was writing this teaching right then. And the Lord, via the body of Christ, was cueing me in on what really happened in John 18. The spiritual explanation of what happened is, there certainly were some in that mob who were controlled by satanic spirits. Jesus certainly would have the authority to bind such things like he had many times before. Because if he previously had been able to prevent the spirits from speaking, he certainly could have bound them in this dire situation. So when they fell to the ground, I think it actually was indicating that Jesus had spiritually cut their legs out from under them. And they now were coming as natural men with no dark spiritual powers in assist. Well, go ahead and put that in your spiritual arsenal if you need it. It's in the Bible for you to claim if the situation calls for it. Bible does say that every knee shall bow to him of things in heaven and things in earth and things under the earth. Well, while those spirits are bowing, they can't stand against us. And here we saw it manifested physically. Wow. The events were about to unfold quickly, but throughout the melee that followed, Jesus still bravely and decisively managed things to get the results he wanted. Because of the comprehensive guidance he had received, he followed the script. He actually was able to take charge of his own arrest. That's incredible, but true. And by means of the right sequence of commands and actions, he achieved the desired result of him being taken, but the apostles allowed to go free. So, the next thing that happened is Mark 14:46. Mark 14:46. And they laid their hands on him and took him. Also Matthew 26:50b, second half of the verse. Then came they and laid hands on Jesus and took him. Those 2 verses are summaries for a number of things occurred, which are chronicled by the other Gospels. Luke 22:49 has more info. Luke 22:49. When they which were about him saw what would follow, they said unto him, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? And one of them smote the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. Mark 14:47. And one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Matthew 26:51. Matthew 26:51. Behold, one of them which were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck a servant of the high priest and smote off his ear. And then John 18:10. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and he smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. The details given in this account speak volumes about what occurred in the next few rapidly sequencing moments. The apostles only had 2 swords with them, so logically they would have been given to the members of the group who knew how to use them. And behold, Peter was one of those. Now, one attribute of Peter, which has been rarely recognized, was that because he was a fisherman, he had to be in excellent physical shape. Hauling in nets, rowing, and the rigors of fishing would have made him quite muscular, and the fact he also was an alpha personality made him a man's man. If I were in a fight, I want Peter on my side. And apparently, Peter was quite proficient with the sword. Well, how so? Well, take into account who he fought. It was the high priest servant at the head of that mob. A better term for servant might be bodyguard. I don't think they would have chosen the high priest kosher chef for this SWAT team assignment. Plus, we cannot imagine the sword fight to be like Hollywood portrays. I looked that up, and I got a quote from John Clements in an article on the internet titled, "Sword Fighting is Not What You Think." He says, quote, "Historically, in the vast majority of cases, a real sword fight was decided and ended with the first blow struck, and often took less than 30 seconds. He also says, quote, "Virtually everything you think you know about sword fighting from Hollywood is wrong," unquote. Imagine the effect on the mob to see their champion, the guy was right in front, to be defeated in such an ignominious manner, bleeding profusely from a head wound, his ear cut off by a fisherman. Who was this Peter the Rock fella from north in hillbilly country? Malchus probably was right-handed. And for Peter to have cut off the ear of his dominant side would be humiliating. That detail that it was his right ear was there to tell a story. Else it would have been left out. Regardless, it was breathtaking that Peter quickly defeated the formidable bodyguard of the high priest. Well, that certainly took them all aback, as a planned deterrent should. Was that what the swords were for that Jesus asked about earlier? But, as in any altercation, the moment blood is shed, the situation immediately becomes much worse and even harder to control. Jesus recognized this and immediately and amazingly stopped things from going further. Enough deterrent had been shown. Matthew 26:52, the script continues. Then said Jesus unto him, "Put again thy sword into his place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then shall the scriptures be fulfilled, that thus it must be? Well, those that feared potential fire from heaven were quaking in their boots by now. John 18:11. John 18:11. Then said Jesus to Peter, put up your sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Look at this realistically. These were the intrepid temple guards, and a sword fight had just ensued. Things could have quickly gotten out of hand. Imagine this in today's terms. The SWAT team had deployed, and someone from the opposition shot and injured one of the officers. Well, what would you expect to follow? Immediate carnage. Shots fired, officer down, fire at will. Those officers work together and know each other, and if one of their comrades is harmed, that would be a turning point in any altercation when the confrontation changes character. It got really serious from this point, and once shots are fired and a comrade injured, the unspoken rule is that the other officers will shoot to kill, right? The parties having swords instead of guns, notwithstanding. In the next few chaotic moments, many of the apostles could have been killed, maimed, or arrested, and all that Jesus built with his ministry, and even the memory of the wonderful sermon that had occurred prior, could have been violently destroyed. But wait a second, wait a moment. A miracle occurred in full view of everyone. Luke 22:51. And Jesus answered and said, suffer ye this far, it's enough. And then he touched the ear of the servant Malchus and healed him. Incredibly, Jesus commanded a halt to the conflict, and according to the script, healed the severed ear of the high priest's servant. That amazing miracle done in full view of all those trained men with swords drawn and hearts pounding, ready to vent their collective wrath because of their comrade's injury, immediately was diffused, and that saved the apostles. Wow! What an incident! But let's consider this miracle further for a moment, because the rules for such things were not momentarily suspended because of the dire nature of this situation. The recipient, Malchus, still had to have some believing to receive. Because Jesus didn't just pick up this ear laying on the ground and say, hey dude, you do lose something? And then slap it on the side of his head and it stuck. No. Whatever happened quickly. But Jesus' compassion was recognized by Malchus, and then he allowed Jesus to touch him. Something else which would have been very remarkable in that situation, because they'd come to arrest Jesus. Throughout this incident, we can easily see that Jesus has such a presence that with the thorough revelation he received, he was able to manage his own arrest. That's amazing. He even was able to tell the mob to let the apostles escape, and incredibly, they obeyed him. The apostles were let go, and Christianity would survive. Oh, wow. Luke 22:52. Luke 22:52. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and captains of the temple and the elders which were come to him, be you come out against a thief with swords and staves? When I was daily with you in the temple, you stretched forth no hands against me. But this is your hour, our power of darkness. Mark 14:48. Mark 14:48. And Jesus answered and said to them, are you come out against a thief with swords, with staves, and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. And then Matthew 26:55. In that same hour, said Jesus to the multitudes, are you come out as against a thief with swords and staves to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple. You didn't lay any hand on me then. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. So, those who preach peace at all costs and disarmament are quite apt to quote Jesus' statement at the time of his arrest. Quote, those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. But they never seem to acknowledge that Jesus actually told the apostles to bring the swords and be prepared. The swords were a deterrent. Ecclesiastes 3:8 states that there's both a time for war and a time for peace. And also, the commandment is thou shalt not murder, not thou shalt not kill. Oh, wow. That has lots of ramifications. So, was Jesus really a pacifist, as many insist? Or was he a pragmatist? Well, hello. What will he be in the book of Revelation? It's important to note that at this critical point, when Jesus was turned over to the high priest guards, all could have been lost. The apostles could have been arrested or worse, and all the momentum of his ministry that had been built destroyed. They needed to be intact and free for his movement to carry on. Well, Jesus accomplished that incredible feat. They even fled with their purse and scrip, their luggage, their possessions intact. The swords provided enough deterrent for that to happen. Yeah, it's an ugly fact. However, sometimes forced must be deterred by force, but always, of course, wrought with wisdom. I remember an incident that my brother Jim told me about when he was a missionary out on the West Coast. General William Westmoreland came to Portland, Oregon to speak, and my brother attended the meeting. As usual in the 70s, the general was confronted by anti-Vietnam War protesters who were in favor of disarmament. And in a question and answer session after the speech, my brother Jim spoke up and said, well, if disarmament is so worthy a cause, why don't we test it first in a similar way to see if it works before demanding it be done on a national scale? So, my brother, with tongue in cheek, proposed, why don't we try it by disarming all the police in Portland and see if it leads to a decrease in crime? Duh! Was my brother a prophet? He said this in the 70s. Of course, that wouldn't work. Did it? The next morning's newspaper sported a picture of General Westmoreland standing with his arm around my brother. As long as there are bullies in this world, it's a fact of life that we will need to deter evil by having the wisdom to arm ourselves and the wisdom to use or not use deterrence. Yeah, Jesus did teach love your enemies, but he also warned to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So, in other words, taken together, one can infer, don't be so dumb you get yourself killed. Life's too complicated for one to state a rule which will work in all cases that the lazy of mind can embrace. Every situation's different, and the only rule which always does apply is to believe God for instructions and then follow them. Well, Jesus did. He had the script. My point in this digression is giving proof that Jesus indeed loved his apostles unto the end. But it was not only words. He backed them up with deeds. And the way he did so clearly demonstrated that he indeed was the Son of God. Another stunning fact is this incident clearly showed the extent of Jesus' preparation, that God had told him what was going to happen, of the knowledge of the impending events for that week. All things were in his hands. He knew his hour was come. It is with that same extensive knowledge and preparation that he was about to turn himself over to the darkness. So now, despite all the pressure that was upon him, Jesus continued to love them to the end. It's just amazing. Luke 22:54. Luke 22:54. Then they took him. Mark 14:50. And all they forsook him and fled. So the disciples got to flee. Matthew 26:56. Matthew 26:56. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. John 18:12. John 18:12. Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. Wow. But then, at this momentous occasion, just like we've seen in football and soccer stadiums across the world, we have the first record of the first streaker. They showed up at big events ever since. Look at Mark 14:51. Mark 14:51. And there followed him a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about him, his naked body, and the young men laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. It's the first streaker! Sorry about that. I couldn't resist. Anyway, now I'm going to defer some things here to Ren Minetti, who will be teaching after the break. But they're also mixed in with Peter's denial, what Ren's going to teach. Back in John 13, Peter insisted he never forsake Jesus, but he laid out his life for Jesus' sake. But Jesus replied that Peter would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed. But there actually is evidence that Peter denied Jesus 6 times. Thrice before one cock crowing, and 3 more times before a second cock crowing. This is supported by a number of things. First, there seemed to be a second time that Peter pledged his loyalty. Later on in the sermon, when Jesus had predicted that they all would be scattered, that's what he said in John 16:32. But at that point, it says all the disciples joined in and said they never deny him. But Jesus repeated his prediction that Peter would deny him. But this time in Mark 14:30, in the second time, Jesus gave a slightly different detail. Look at Mark 14:30. Mark 14:30. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto you, that this day, even in this night, before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. Well, the first time in John 13, he said cock crow, implying once. Here's twice. So, this is where we get the info that supports 2 cock crowings and 6 denials. Also, the details of each denial do involve more than 3 people and places. However, Michael Rood says there's only 3 denials, while Stalker, Werewolf, and Bullinger say they were 6. So the first denial, the place was before Annas by the entrance of the courtyard. The accuser was a female doorkeeper. the second denial. The place was before Caiaphas by a fire in the courtyard, and the accuser was a female servant. The third denial was the same place before Caiaphas by the fire in the courtyard, but the accuser was a man. The fourth denial was before Caiaphas, but by the porch, and the accuser was a female servant. The fifth denial was back by the fire in the courtyard before Caiaphas, but the accusers were several people. And then finally, the sixth denial was before Caiaphas by the fire in the courtyard, but the accuser was a kinsman of Malchus who had had his ear cut off, and Jesus healed it. So you can see they're in different places and different people, and it's more than 3 incidents. So now let's cover these. Event 6.33. Event 6.33. Jesus taken before Annas and Peter's first denial. This is in John 18:13. Now some of this Ren's going to cover, so I'm going to skip a few verses, but John 18:33. Led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And I wonder where that prophecy came from. I don't know. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That other disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside, and then went out that other disciple who was known to the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. It was at this point the first denial occurred. Then said the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Are you not thou also one of this man's disciples? And Peter denied, I am not. Then the servants and officers stood there who had made a fire of coals. It was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Now, verses John 18:19 through 23, that'll be what Ren covers in his next session. Next event is event 6.34. 6.34, Jesus is taken before Caiaphas. John 18:24. Now Annas had sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Luke 22:54b. And Peter followed afar off, and when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall, and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. And then Mark 14:53, Mark 14:53. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and elders and scribes. And Peter followed them afar off, even into the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Then the rest of this passage, Mark 14:55 through 65, that Ren's going to cover that in next session. And then we're going to go to Matthew 26:57. Matthew 26:57, and they that laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. And then the rest of the verses in this, Matthew 26:59 through 68, that'll be covered by Ren in the next session. So the next event after this is Peter's second denial, event 6.35. Event 6.35, Peter's second denial. And we go to Luke 22:56 for this. Luke 22:56. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him, and said, This man was also with him. And he denied, saying, Woman, I know him not. Mark 14:66. Mark 14:66. And as Peter was beneath in the palace, there came one of the maids of the high priest. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, "And you also was with Jesus of Nazareth." But he denied, saying, "I know not, neither I understand what you are saying." Matthew 26:69 is the next one. Matthew 26:69. Now Peter sat without in the palace, and a damsel came unto him, saying, "Thou was also with Jesus of Galilee." But he denied before them all, saying, "I know not what thou sayest." And then finally, the second denial, Luke 18:25. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself, and they said therefore unto him, "Art not thou also one of the disciples?" He denied it and said, "I am not." Now, this last one in John 18:25, the way it's positioned, it actually could be the second or the third or the fourth denial. It's not specific enough. So the next event 6.36, event 6.36, the third denial and the first cock crow. Luke 22:58 is where we go for that. Luke 22:58. And after a little while, another saw him and said, "You art also of them." And Peter said, "Oh man, I'm not." And Mark 14:68b, and he went out into the porch, and the cock crowed. Next event 6.37, is Peter's fourth denial. Event 6.37, we go to Mark 14:69. And a maid saw him again, and began to say to them that stood by, "This is one of them." And he denied it again. And Matthew 26:71. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him, and said unto them that were there, "This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth." And he denied with an oath. And he said, "I know not the man." Event 6.38, Peter's fifth denial. Peter's fifth denial, Mark 14:70. Mark 14:70. And a little while after, they that stood by said again to Peter, "Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and your speech agrees thereto." His accent. And he began to curse and swear, saying, "I know not this man of whom you speak." And then Matthew 26:73. Matthew 26:73. And after a while came unto him, and they that stood by, and said to Peter, "Surely thou art one of them, for your speech betrayeth thee." And then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I don't know the man." The final event 6.38, Peter's sixth denial and the cock crow, the second cock crow. Event 6.38. We go to Luke 22:59. And about the space of 1 hour after, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Of a truth, this fellow also was with him, for he's a Galilean." And Peter said, "Man, I know not what you say." And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crowed. Verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. He was within sight. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him before the cock crowed, "Thou shalt deny me thrice." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. And the men that held Jesus mocked him and smote him, and when they had blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is it that smote you?" And many other things blasphemously spoke they against him. This final denial happened about a whole hour later. Jesus had been beaten and mocked and abused for that entire time. And then, from the midst of it, At the right moment, Jesus turned and saw Peter afar off after the sixth denial, and their eyes met, and Peter realized that the prophecy had come true. And he went out from there where he was and wept bitterly. By this time, Jesus had been beaten badly and was bruised and bleeding, but he still had the presence of mind to act by revelation and turn and look out to see Peter at the exact moment needed to help confront Peter with his fears. I'm sure that memory was burned into Peter's mind and haunted him. Mark 14:72. Mark 14:72. And the second time the cock crew, and Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And when he thought thereon, he wept. And then final scripture of the night, Matthew 26:74. Matthew 26:74. And immediately the cock crew. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, which said unto him, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and wept bitterly. You know, Peter could have gone in two directions at this point. He could have let his fears consume him, and he could have been too ashamed to go back with the apostles. Or he could have faced his fears to conquer them. Jesus loved Peter. And he had not told him that prophecy about the denials to condemn him, but to confront him. Because Peter was the makings of a great leader. A leader who would be needed to manage the first century church. But in order to do that, he would have to be fearless. Fear is our enemy. Fear can defeat faith if we let it. We can't be effective if we have both fear and faith. Therefore, we must face our fears and conquer them. And the fuel to conquer fear is the Word of God. So, my encouragement to all of you is to identify your fears, confront them, and conquer them. Don't let fear intimidate you into inaction. Push through your fears by acting on the Word of God, and you'll watch them melt away. Peter needed to do that in order to be ready to be the leader the church and Jesus needed him to be. He had some more lessons along that road till he was ready. But Peter did respond. And he boldly and fearlessly led the church through its first years and boldly confronted the high priests and their powers, and the church survived. Well, praise the Lord. That's why Jesus did this. He loved him unto the end. Let's take a break. Bless you.